On paper, the Subaru Outback and the Mazda CX-50 are fairly similar, but their approaches are vastly different. So today I'm going to go over both of them and see if I can help you decide which one is better. If you enjoy fun, detailed car content without fluff, consider subscribing and hitting the bell for notifications. First, we're going to set off in the Mazda CX-50. So you'll get to choose from two different modes of thrust: a 2.5-liter naturally aspirated double overhead cam inline-4, making about 186 horsepower, or a turbocharged version of that, and it makes 227 horsepower, 310 pound-feet of torque on regular gasoline. It actually has 256 horsepower if you throw premium in it. It's kind of limited by the 6-speed automatic, and not because that is a bad transmission, because it provides a smooth shifting, refined experience with the turbo model, but the transmission is so focused on giving you a buttery experience that the shifts are slow. Despite that, here's what I got from 0 to 60 with the turbo. Oh. The shifts are still pretty slow from the 6-speed auto. Off the line grunt pretty good. 0 to 60 came up in a respectable 6.9 seconds. The passing power is really what's immense, and since it has 310 pound-feet of torque on regular, you really don't need to rev the thing out in order to get that performance. It just makes for a luxurious experience. The engine also has stellar response for forced induction. It uses a variable vane turbo that, in short, helps the thing build boost quickly at low RPMs, allowing it to almost feel naturally aspirated. Real quick, I would like to thank the friendly dealerships Royal on the Eastside and Royal South Mazda for letting me test drive a couple CX-50s and Outbacks over the last year to make this video possible. Both are located here in Bloomington, Indiana. If you're in the market, check them out. The last time I drove the car, I had a turbo model, so this time I'm glad to be in a non-turbo spec so I can tell you about both. Here with the naturally aspirated 2.5 liter, the transmission has definitely gotten better tuned over the years. I don't feel like I have to mash the gas. This isn't a super big crossover, so it doesn't need a lot of power to be sufficient for most buyers. Now, I have found the transmission to sometimes hunt for gears, but for the most part, once you've gotten the thing rolling, it behaves the way that I want it to. It doesn't lug the engine too much. The only thing is, gas mileage is just okay. And not really improved over the turbo. While I find this to have linear acceleration and good throttle response in most situations, let's quantify its straight line prowess with a quick dash to 60. A very slow shift there. Acceptable performance, although 0 to 60 there came up in about 9.2 seconds, which is usually what I get with the Subaru Outback. However, this is what happened earlier last year. However, I'll get to the Subi here soon, which also does offer a turbocharged version that also offers a lot more power. So with either of these cars, you got a choice. Not flooring it or anything, just about half throttle. Gets up to speed just fine, but road noise is pronounced. Although to call it noisy would be a bit dramatic. With the standard naturally aspirated engine, it definitely won't sound as premium and upscale as the turbo because it does need to, pick up the revs a little bit more. Just like you can't evaluate TikTok without mentioning crippling screen addiction, I can't compare the Mazda to a Subaru without talking all-wheel drive. The CX-50 is going to have that standard with an off-road mode. It can be proactive at shifting power to the back depending on road conditions and drive modes, but it will primarily send power to the front. The Subaru is truly full-time and effective at sending power to the back, and like the Mazda, uses brakes to divert power side to side well enough, especially with the standard X mode and optional deep mud X mode. In the Mazda, there's no full-size spare tire like what you get with the Onyx or Wilderness Outbacks, but with roughly 8.5 inches of ground clearance, this proved reasonably capable in an off-road test done by Driving Sports TV. Like the Subi, it is good at using the brakes to shuffle power side to side and making do with a sub subpar approach angle. I'm still going to give the rugged edge to the Outback for the dedicated trims and full-time system, but Mazda's made up some ground. Thankfully, they also outfitted it with copious amounts of body cladding to please us plastic enthusiasts. Now, on very uneven, broken pavement like I have here, the CX-50 is a little bit on the firm side for the segment, especially compared to the Outback, but I'd still call it supple. The thing that this struggles with the most is going to be a jitteriness when you have a lot of imperfections right after one another. So you're driving on a rough road. This does not have independent rear suspension. And I will admit that in 95% of driving scenarios, even on back roads, this is a better handling vehicle than most in the class. It still could just be a little bit more composed like the Mazda CX-5 in my opinion. Now on tighter, smooth corners is where the CX-50 shines. This is honestly a fun little SUV. I mean, you have communicative steering that, you know, isn't darty but feels very precise and ultra predictable. And they nailed the weighting too. Maybe it's on the heavy side for some people. Body roll too is very well kept. And that's probably thanks to a wide track and low roofline for an SUV. The stance also makes it look a little more imposing from the outside and inside than the Subaru, as it feels wider on the road and also has notably less visibility. It's an aggressive view for the class that will likely be more of a downside than a pro, but that just depends on your outlook. Sorry. Now around corners with imperfections in the middle of them, feels confident. Steering is reassuring, but the Outback's just not as fun as this. Not by a long shot. Especially when you throw the turbo in this, it's a much more engaging SUV, but buying a mid-size SUV, we need to talk about a lot of the more practical stuff. So when it comes to the interior space, you're going to have a completely different approach here. So the Mazda does have like a lot of these hard touch plastics that I suppose will be a little bit more rugged than what you'll find in some of the other Mazda products, but it does end up leaving the interior feeling a little bit cheaper. And then the tech is also a bit polarizing, although I personally enjoy it. So you'll have an 8.8-inch touchscreen on the base. I have a 10.3-inch screen. It actually does have a touch function to it, but only if you're parked and through like Apple CarPlay. And it does have wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which is nice. But while you're driving, you always have to control it through the dial down here, which a lot of people do not like. The system itself is oversimplified and could be improved, but the satisfying feedback from the dial and having to pinpoint my finger, especially on rougher roads, that takes more effort than just controlling the system where my hand naturally lies. The resolution is okay too. The sound system in here is pretty good. You're gonna have a Bose optional system, but even the standard Mazda acoustic audio setup is great and easily beats the Subaru Outback, which only has 6 speakers on most trims and just 4 on the base. But I'm really happy overall that Mazda includes an analog experience here. Of course, this is preference, but I love having physical, simple HVAC controls that you can get to very quickly. Everything is clearly laid out, but it still looks well integrated here into the dashboard. And this, opposed to the Outback's touchscreen approach, is just easier to live with. Most things here in the CX-50 are buttons, and it also just has a solid feel to it. Not as luxurious as what I'd come to expect from Mazda, but it does feel high quality. Now, here's where the bad stuff starts happening, and that's gonna be space. Now, it does have a good back seat, especially considering it's a Mazda, but it still feels kind of more cramped than some other vehicles that are a similar size. Though that's more due to the interior width and smaller windows. I'm 6'3" and can fit in the front and back with ease, just like in the Outback. As I mentioned earlier, the CX-50 has less soft touch materials than most other Mazdas. So while I would confidently argue that this has a more upscale aesthetic and construction, it doesn't feel as plush and cozy as the Outback. So the Outback received a few changes here for 2023, like the Onyx edition now can also be had with the naturally aspirated engine. But I have the turbo car here today. I've driven all sorts of Outbacks, so I'll talk about both power plants and how they stack up to the Mazda. The base engine is a 2.5-liter Boxer 4. It's now available on every trim except for the Wilderness. It's naturally aspirated, hooked up to a CVT, and makes 182 groaning horses. The 2.4-liter twin-scroll turbo Boxer 4 in the XT models gives the Outback a shot of adrenaline. You will have 260 horsepower and 277 pound-feet of torque. And this is on regular gasoline. The CVT also, while I do wish this had some sort of traditional gearbox, works well enough because, you know, it never feels like it's lugging the engine. It gets to where it needs to be somewhat quickly, but the whole experience here with the turbo does have more lag than what you'll find in the Mazda. And that could be due to the transmission or more turbo lag. Response is not terrible by any means, and when it all comes together, this thing flies. Here's what an XT can do to 60. Again, pretty mild there, and then pulls like a mother. Okay, I reset the Draggy and I did it again. 5.8 seconds to 60 with the Subaru Outback XT. That makes the Outback substantially quicker on regular fuel. On premium, the Mazda should close the gap some. And the naturally aspirated Outback, you won't be winning too many races, but the CVT does a pretty good job of reacting to your requests. It's more than enough for cruising, and while it may not fulfill your wants, it should satisfy the needs of most who aren't at high elevation. And if you need your two-row crossover to play truck, both peak at 3,500 pounds for towing, with the Outback holding a slight edge in naturally aspirated form. And the same story can be told for the gas mileage between these two, although I should note that some complain about the Outback XT struggling to hit its EPA numbers. I would say that they're pretty comparable in terms of acceleration. The Mazda just feels more natural and linear due to the 6-speed automatic. Now, unfortunately, no 2023 Outback was available for me to drive today, and they are on a stop sale as well. So right now I am driving a very, very similar 2020 Onyx XT. Mainly packaging is what changed between these 3 years. Anyway, it's still noticeably quieter than the CX-50. And if I had to drive one on a long distance, hands down, I'd choose the Subaru. You also even have like soft touch materials where your knees rest, something that's nice for a tall person. This is among the best for the money when it comes to a highway cruising SUV, but it definitely holds its own when you bring it out to a back road. So taking it through corners here, I can, you know, go over these imperfections, and even with a little bit of G-forces coming into them, the car stays very composed and very comfortable. It's definitely a lot more plush than the CX-50. Bad roads don't disrupt it as much, the rear end feels more settled, plus you have lighter steering that's quick, and I think it actually has a quicker ratio than the Mazda. It just doesn't have the same level of feedback, and I don't think it's calibrated as well, so it doesn't feel quite as natural, and in turn less predictable, maybe a little bit less precise. I think this just has the advantage of still being able to turn in quickly, and since it has a lower center of gravity due to the engine orientation and it just kind of having the wagon body style, body roll isn't too bad despite them still not springing it very stiff. And that's just a consistent attribute among Subarus. They're just really good handling, comfortable cars. So whatever way you go with an Outback, you're gonna have more comfortable seats. The base model doesn't have lumbar adjustment, but I've still not really found that to be a problem. The seats kind of hug me nicely, but they're not too aggressive. And at 6'3", I still have great headroom, even with a sunroof. And if you get a limited or touring spec, you actually have a thigh extension here for the driver's side, and that will improve upon thigh sport even more for tall people. Additional nice touches include the Outback's retractable crossbars and the Mazda's rear doors that open freakishly wide. Unfortunately, I should also mention that availability of lower trim CX-50s is much more limited than the Outback, so keep that in mind while shopping. When it comes to pricing, these are similar across the whole trim line. So if we're just considering features, these are a similar value. I wouldn't say that the CX-50 is very good at matching the Outback when it comes to overall cabin comfort or space. When you get in the cargo area, you're gonna notice even more space. It seems taller, it's a bit wider, and then if you fold down the seats, there's an even bigger difference between the two. When it comes to features, I think the Mazda may have a leg up in overall available features. I think the optional Bose sound system beats the optional Harman Kardon system in here. The Outback can't get a panoramic sunroof, whereas you get that as standard with the CX-50 so long as you get the preferred Plus. You can also get a heads-up display in the Mazda, that bigger gauge cluster, along with standard blind spot monitoring, something Subi won't include on all trims. Both come with standard autonomous braking, lane assist, and adaptive cruise. My only gripe with the Subaru's interior is the touchscreen for being a bit slow and dated feeling, yet taking up a prominent space in the cabin. Both cars have wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. For 2023, Subaru tweaked the touchscreen interface to display more HVAC controls all of the time, making it slightly less annoying than before. Despite those efforts, I believe Mazda's classy approach will age better. Reliability for the CX-50 remains partially unknown as it is new, but both Skyactiv engines and transmissions have proven themselves to be sturdy. More so than the Subaru, which has improved tremendously in the last 5 years with the updated transmissions and piston oil rings. I'd trust both of these, but I'd give the edge to the CX-50 as the Outback has struggled more with recalls and minor issues than most Mazdas as of late. Overall, both may be viewed as the premier rugged-ish two-row SUV from each brand, but their approaches contrast one another deeply. So to say one is better than the other would be kind of excessive because they are just very different cars. Whenever the CX-50 came out, a lot of people were trying to liken it to a Mazda Outback. That is not the case. Yes, it has a more wagony-like stance and vibe than the CX-5, but it's not any more comfortable than the CX-5. In fact, I would say it takes a step backwards in terms of ride refinement and even materials, whereas the Outback takes a step up from the Forester in both of those categories. And in turn feels more like a justification for the increase in price despite not gaining any real amount of interior volume over the Forester. Here are my final thoughts. The Subaru is more well-rounded. It's more forgiving and composed on the worst of roads, the cabin is more posh, it's more practical, more efficient in naturally aspirated form, and a touch quicker. Plus there's an approachable aspect to the Outback that isn't present with the CX-50, all attributing to this being the winner for the more traditional crossover SUV buyer. However, sharp interior design with satisfying analog controls, fun on-road demeanor, and a more refined powertrain while still providing a healthy backseat and acceptable cargo area make the Mazda my personal choice between the two, and one that shouldn't be ignored. It's the better ride for the person who deep down wanted something that was more along the sport luxury route. That said, these two do not feel like close competitors after driving them. In fact, the CX-50's biggest foe is right under that big nose. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please leave a like to help me battle the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe and hit the bell for more. And thank you to my loyal patrons. I'll catch you in the next one.